Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And I got to change that bio because effective immediately, I am retired. So I retired this weekend. Tomorrow's my last day, but I'm counting it today. I'm really honored that you guys would come out today on a basketball Sunday during March Madness, exactly. I see a lot of friendly faces. That really helps. I have to start with some thanks. None of this painting would be possible without Lanny Perry. His name shares the podium with me. Lanny forgot more about this engagement than I'll ever know. And I just am really very thankful to him. Ninon Parker has been a really huge help to me through this. She's met with me several times as we tried to paint Tuscumbia realistically. There'll be more paintings coming from the Tuscumbia area as we go through this. Dr. Lori Johnson, who you just saw, was huge in kind of getting the word out, and I really thank the Colbert County Historical Landmarks Foundation for letting me do this at their meeting. It's a big ask to get to kind of hijack somebody's meeting and come in to do a painting unveiling. And then, of course, the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area is an amazing organization. They do a lot of great work. And this is a series that was developed by the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area for the upcoming Civil War Trail. So over the course of the next 2 years, you'll begin to see this group putting markers around, putting the story of the incredible importance that the Shoals area had on the conflict. And so you'll begin to see that. These paintings are just kind of the first visible sign of what's coming in that new trail. So just so you know, afterwards, I've got the paintings up here that I've completed so far for the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area. The first one is the Florence gunboat battle. This is the burning of Hood's wagon train in Russellville. This is Gravelly Springs. And this small one, which was really the first large painting I've ever done. I'm not a great painter. I'm just learning it as I go. But that was the first one, and that is out at Bainbridge Crossing. And then this is the painting here, the engagement at Little Bear Creek that I'm unveiling today. So feel free to come up afterwards. We do sell the prints, and selling the prints really helps me in continuing to fund this. So thank you very much. This event happened at Tuscumbia. Can y'all hear me okay in the back? Sounds okay? Okay. October 26th and 27th, 1863 is when this happened. So let me give you some idea of what's happening in the Civil War. Now, there's some people here that are big Civil War buffs that know all of the details. There's others that know nothing. So bear with me if you're a Civil War buff. The war started in 61. In April in South Carolina, it went through 1862. Now we're in 1863. Everybody's heard of the Battle of Gettysburg. Everybody's heard of the fall of Vicksburg. So where we are in the war at this time is about 3 months ago from this, Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg have happened. So watershed events. And so now the Union armies are beginning to decide what are they going to do after those historic battles. So this is the strategic situation, and I'm a military guy, so this is kind of always what's drawn me to the Civil War, especially since it happened on our ground. So you've got Vicksburg out here. Grant's army is being split up. It's now it's in Sherman's 15th Corps is here. You've got General Rosecrans with the Union Army of the Cumberland, and they have worked their way down to Chattanooga, taken Chattanooga, and are driving down trying to get into Georgia. And then the Army of the Ohio with Burnside is up around Knoxville. So that's kind of what's happening at the moment. And then all of a sudden, General Robert E. Lee in Virginia detaches a powerful fighting force under James Longstreet down to Georgia. It's the first time this has happened in the war. And they come down and launch an assault in the scattered forces under Rosecrans at Chickamauga and defeat them and trap them back in Chattanooga. And all of a sudden, the Union, who had two incredible victories, are now pinned up, under siege, unable to eat, unable to get supplies, starving to death as winter approaches in Chattanooga. And all of a sudden, it is all hands on deck for the Union to relieve the siege and get reinforcements. The first people at hand are Grant's forces down at Vicksburg, and all of a sudden, Grant takes command of the theater in the West, which to me, if you're a Civil War buff, the stuff with Lee and Grant in the Richmond area is really boring. The real cool stuff happens out west in our places. Sherman moves up the river and down over to Corinth and Iuka. And his orders from Halleck, who was Grant's predecessor before this, are to follow the railroad, that's the Memphis and Charleston Railroad that runs through Tuscumbia, and get over and break the siege. Well, deposing him is a guy named S.D. Lee, Stephen D. Lee. Not a lot of people know about Stephen D. Lee, but we'll talk about him in a minute. So that's what the strategic situation, that's why Union and Confederate troops are fighting around Tuscumbia in the late fall of 1863. So if you follow the Civil War at all, the two names you probably know if you're from around here are Fighting Joe Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest. So why in the world is Stephen D. Lee, a guy most of you have never heard of, opposing the Union forces in this area? Where's Wheeler and where's Forrest? Well, Wheeler was attached to the army that's surrounding Chattanooga, and in order to break the supply line, this general named Braxton Bragg says, look, I want you to go out through Tennessee, break the supply line, and let's starve these guys and let's take the surrender of a large Union army, and that will reinvigorate us after the loss of Vicksburg and after the loss of Chattanooga. So Wheeler goes out here, and he ends it up back in the Shoals, and they are worn out. Imagine driving this in a car, and then imagine doing it on horseback in October with people following you and not enough food to eat, and your horses are dying, and you're living off the land, and everybody and their brother is chasing you. Wheeler had his hands full. Forrest, if anything, was a large personality, and he did not get along with Braxton Bragg. And they got into an argument, and basically Bragg said, I am banishing you from this army. And he sent him with, I think, 297 men, his escort, and said, I want you to go to northern Mississippi and harass the Union, but I want you out of here. So arguably one of the most intelligent and naturally strategic generals in the Confederate Army is now got, about the size of a small regiment, and he's banished to northern Mississippi. And that's why we end up with Stephen D. Lee here. So here are the three Union generals. Sherman, has anybody never heard of William Tecumseh Sherman? All right. He has got a reputation that he is well-founded in a lot of ways. I do a whole talk on the fact that Civil War is so dangerous because the most ruthless people rise to the surface. Sherman is one of them. Incredibly ruthless. It's what happens in war. Those are the people that excel, and he excelled in what he did here. I like this guy, Francis Blair Jr., is a man whose father was a senator. If you know Washington, people still stay at Blair House in Washington, D.C. His brother Montgomery was on Lincoln's cabinet. So this is what we would call a political general, except he wasn't. What Grant said about him was that this guy had a different personality in warfare than he did in politics. He was an excellent commander and was a career military officer before the war. Osterhaus was a Prussian general that had come over, and there was a great need for military men, so Osterhaus came over, got a commission in the Union Army, and was an excellent commander. Most of the documents that us historians use about this battle come from Osterhaus. He actually, in 1915, died as the last living Civil War Union pensioner. Interesting story, yeah. So here are the Union units involved. There are about 8,000 men on the Union side. It's Sherman's 15th Corps. And there's a lot of words up here, but what I want you to think about is these are men from Ohio, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, a little bit of West Virginia. So this is the Western Army. These are tough fighters. They've been through Vicksburg, they've been all over Mississippi, they've fought through Tennessee. It's very experienced. And another important thing to remember is that this is an age where modern warfare was just taking hold. These men had just been issued brand new 58 caliber Springfield rifled muskets. Everybody was carrying them. The Confederate side was a mishmash of weapons, and we had relatives in this battle that I'm sure probably showed up with nothing more than a shotgun. And think about the discrepancy in the firepower. And they also were issued 10 and 20 pounder rifled Parrott cannon. And if you know anything about artillery, the more rounds a cannon fires, the less accurate it gets, especially in this era. These are brand new rifles. They're rifle cannon. They're incredibly accurate. Now here's old Stephen D. Lee. He was a career officer prior to the war, and here's an interesting story about him. We might not be telling the story of the Civil War without Stephen D. Lee. And I would argue that he's one of the most controversial figures that you've never heard of. He was one of 4 men sent to Fort Sumter in Charleston by Beauregard to go see Colonel Anderson and say, will you surrender or will we fire on you? And Colonel Anderson said, we will be starved out in 3 days. And his message was, don't fire on us. Let us surrender. Let's not fire the opening shots. Lee was a hothead, as were the people with him. Lee went back to Beauregard and said, and his message was, in 4 hours, we're going to fire on you. So if a cooler head had prevailed there, it might be possible that actual open conflict might have been averted. Who knows? But it's an interesting story to know that that man was at one of those watershed moments in history. Colonel Jeffrey Forrest was, I think, 22. He's the younger brother of Nathan Bedford Forrest. He will be wounded at this battle, shot through both thighs. He'll be taken to the Steele home in Tuscumbia and paroled, basically. He takes an oath never to fight again. And 3 months later, he's in another battle fighting for the Confederacy in another reckless charge and is killed. So Forrest is, once again, a really interesting character. And then Philip Roddy, I live at Hermitage and Wood Avenue. And there's just maybe 100 yards down is Roddy's former house and a marker to him. He was a riverboat captain in this area. He ended up as a businessman in New York and died in London after the war as a successful businessman. And there's some really interesting things. I think there's actually, Roddy will figure prominently in a couple of books that are being written by kind of the Civil War community around here. Fascinating fella. Now, if you compare this, Confederate versus this, look at all these numbers. Look how few this is. This was a small cavalry detachment, which was my job in the Army. Cavalry is meant to delay, slow down ponderous units. And so that's exactly what these guys were doing. They were trying to delay. They knew they couldn't stop. They were trying to delay. And a third of them had been sent off. So their instructions were to delay the advance of this large force under Sherman, which had devolved to under Blair. Okay. So here's this is kind of what the documents look like, and the errors that come up in warfare. It's called the fog of war. So Wheeler's men were whipped and dog-tired. They crossed the Tennessee River at the Muscle Shoals. They were moving back to Bragg at Chattanooga. They were not a fighting force. Stephen D. Lee had 3,000 men, probably 1,000 at the beginning of this battle. But Sherman doesn't know that. He can't get spies and scouts over there. So he estimates and sends back the word that there's 10,000 Confederates there. So he's moving slowly because he really doesn't know what's in front of him, which I think is interesting. The fog of war makes people do strange things. And so their job, and what brings us to Little Bear Creek right here, there's Spring Creek, Tuscumbia, Florence, is this railroad coming from Corinth. They're trying to rebuild that railroad so they can get supplies into Chattanooga. Interestingly, on October 11th, Sherman leaves Memphis and is almost captured by roving bands of Confederate cavalry. And so it's another reason why he's cautious at this point, because he had just had a very narrow escape a couple of weeks earlier from being captured. Osterhaus and the large Union presence gets to Corinth around October 2nd. General Blair assumes command, and then Sherman reports on October 21st that as they try to repair this railroad, that he's facing 10,000 Confederates. Why did he think that? Well, part of why he thought that was, this is just a little vignette. At Barton Station, Colonel Forrest's cavalry, about 400 men had formed. The colonel was in command. On this intelligence, I immediately brought all the cavalry and a section of horse artillery. The 5th Ohio made a brilliant saber charge, but could not cause the enemy to yield his positions. Most people that study the Civil War don't think they're having cavalry saber charges out in the West at this point, but I found several instances. We'll talk more about that. And I love this quote because I can tell you, but to hear it in the men's own words to me is pretty fascinating. This is Colonel George Stone, the commander of the 25th Iowa. On Sunday evening, our division received marching orders at 4 a.m. He goes on to say, we continued skirmishing during the entire day and renewed it on the 27th, literally fighting them from Cherokee to Tuscumbia. The Confederates were relentless. The terrain was rough. They knew it. They were very good at their jobs in delaying the Union forces, and that's why it took such a long time for these Union forces to even reach Little Bear Creek. So now we come to the painting. So I grew up as a Civil War buff, and there was a painter that I admired greatly, and he did a series of paintings of the Civil War that I just fell in love with. So I'm really, my hat's off to him because I'm really trying to follow in his footsteps. He died at 26 and was cut way too short. So what I'm trying to do is picture yourself in a hot air balloon looking at the battlefield. That's how, so we're at, I don't know, the elevation is trying to give us a sense of what the battle looks like. So if this is a little detail of the painting, here's the railroad bridge. Here's the old Memphis Pike coming into Tuscumbia. Here's Spring Creek. Here's the old fairgrounds. There's the mill. Here's the Helen Keller House. Here's the Winston Plantation. Everybody got your bearings? See where you are? Okay, Tennessee River up here. They had prepared positions about 3 miles. There's a small fort that's still there. You can still see it, although it's on private property, and I'm going to show you all this, and nobody's allowed to go on private property, so please don't. But that's still there. But it's about 3 miles of entrenchments because they knew that this was a route the Union Army was going to come. So they were moving into prepared positions. So on the morning of the 26th, about 8:30 at Barton Station and Mount Zion Church, The Federals move out, and they're contested, although most of the Confederate forces are in the entrenchments or along the river line. It takes them till afternoon before they get to the creek, and they're fighting the whole way. Nothing is not contested. And when they get there, they deploy at the Hanson House. Now, let me go back. This house is still here. This is a hunting camp. This is Willingham Road, which is interesting to me because I'm a Willingham. And so this is Willingham Road, and that house is still there. It's beautiful. I hope somebody restores it one day. It's an old hunting camp right now, but it's a beautiful piece of property. But now, as the Union forces under Blair and Osterhaus begin to form, they go to the Hanson House. Rick, are you here? Hey, there you are. Yeah, great. That's his house. I drove up in his parking lot. That's what you do when you're trying to research things. I show up and knock on his front door and say, hey. Yeah, we've got a couple of people that have property and had property at the time, or their family did at the time of the battle. So this house still exists. It looks a lot different now, but I'm sure it's on the same footing. So, and the owner of that house, to show how divided this area was, the owner of that house, 2 of his sons were off fighting for the Union. We think of it being monolithic Confederate. This area was not in any way, shape, or form that way. Every other house had Union sympathies or Confederate sympathies. And that was just North Alabama. That was the reality, neighbor against neighbor. An artillery duel erupted with the smaller Federal cannons, and then when the big ones got there, that silenced the Confederate batteries. So now the Union decides, we've got 2 crossings, we've got the bridge, and we've got 2 crossings. The bridge was in very much disrepair at that point. And they decided that they were going to push across south of the railroad crossing. And you can see Confederates are lining the eastern bank. The Union forces are pushing forward in large strength along the western bank, trying to hold them, trying to force their way across, trying to tie up as many Confederate soldiers as they can so that they're less opposed at the major crossings. So Osterhaus pushes skirmishers across. It ends up being the 27th and the 3rd Missouri across, and I think the 3rd U.S. Infantry may have been involved in this also. There's only a portion of the Confederates there to defend, but what they did have there was Colonel Jeffrey Forrest and the 11th Alabama, and what was Forrest famous for? Impetuous cavalry charges. So there's a neighborhood here now where this ground is, but shock and awe, do y'all remember that term from the Gulf War? While they had light skirmishers loosely formed on the eastern bank, the best way to push those guys back was a cavalry charge. And they did, and the Union, these were Western boys, they quickly formed, they quickly got in line, they quickly fired a volley and pushed them back. But it did stop the offensive on this day. So the major action on this particular day, the first day, is that this cavalry charge pushes the Union back to the other side of the creek. So they go back and they sleep that night. It's fitful sleep because they know they're going to fight the next day. And they don't know what each other's intentions are. The Confederates are rapidly pulling in all the reinforcements they can. General Roddy's command is north of the river. They ride all night to make it through, to cross the Tennessee River. No easy feat with no bridges. They're getting across any way they can. And they show up exhausted and get into line. The Union doesn't know, they think they're facing 10,000 men on the other side. They fought every day trying to get there. Well, the next day, they wake up and they start to push across that same ford, and they push more and more forces over to the east bank. And they realize at that point, and there's ferocious fighting there. And Susan here lives right, her family owned part of that battlefield during this time. But the Confederates knew they were outnumbered, and all they were doing was having a delaying action. And so as the Union pushed forward, the Confederates would form a line, fire, fall back, form a line, fire, fall back, until they eventually abandoned the entrenchments, filed back through Tuscumbia, and there were battles all the way to Tuscumbia on the Frankfort Road and south of the river, or the railroad line, until they went all the way to Leeton. The Union's troops stopped at Tuscumbia. They found Forrest wounded in a house. They set up headquarters in the old Franklin Hotel, which I think is at 5th and Water, I think is where that was, and began to kind of put their forces back together, getting ready for the next push. And so Leeton is back over here, and that's where the Confederates retreated to, and they were waiting for the next move of the Union. Well, while the Union finally gets over here to take Tuscumbia, Grant is now in command, and he sends a telegram to him and says, look, this is way too slow. Our guys are going to starve to death in Chattanooga. Leave this line of approach, cross back at Eastport, and go on the north side of the river where we know we don't have as many Confederate forces. So they go through Florence, they go through Huntsville to Bridgeport, and then relieve the garrison in Chattanooga. All the paintings, just so you know, have this kind of, I take you through it, and this, you get the little key to the painting comes with it, so you can, and it'll be attached to the back of it, you can walk yourself through the battle if you ever take somebody, through the house to see it. And this is really kind of the route Sherman takes, and this sets up the Battle of Chattanooga, where the Confederates are driven out, and they begin preparing for the march to the sea. There's a story from Sherman's time in Florence that I think is pretty interesting, and it gives you an idea of the guerrilla fighting, especially north of the river. So as the Union troops are moving through Waterloo and Gravelly Springs, there's a little unit of soldiers that are kind of delayed. Maybe they stop to steal some chickens or eat breakfast somewhere or set up camp and reshoe a horse, who knows why. But they stop, and while they're there, they get captured by Confederate guerrillas who are in roving bands of horsemen all over the Shoals, especially north of the river. Lauderdale County's full of them. Well, they capture this one young man who turns out to be the son of Major Ezra Taylor, who is a clerk at Sherman's headquarters. And this guy goes to Sherman's headquarters, which is in Florence, and says, look, the Confederates partisans have just captured my son. You got to do something to help me get him back. So what Sherman does is he collects 3 to 4 prominent men from Florence, and one of them is a Mr. Foster, and says, you've got 24 hours to get this guy released, or the same thing's going to happen to you. We're going to strip you down. We're going to tie you to the back of a wagon and parade you through the streets. And 24 hours later, Ezra's son shows back up. So tell me that there wasn't an underground network out there of people talking. So these are the kind of things that just happen all the time in these little vignettes. I do want to go, one thing that I forgot to mention, and this is really to me why I do this. Let's talk about Sergeant Nehemiah Redding of Company D in the 25th Ohio. He was killed in the fighting on the 26th and never found. So here's a young man. I don't have a picture of him. He's not in Find a Grave. There's no record of where he's buried. He's not been picked up and moved to Shiloh National Battlefield Park. So somewhere out on the battlefield, somewhere, is a man named Nehemiah Redding, a young man from Iowa who came down here and fought. The reason I do this work is that this is hallowed ground. The next painting I'm about to do is where Shoal Creek, where 72 crosses Shoal Creek, right before you get to the McDonald's, past the Catfish House. Who knew there was a battlefield there? Anybody? There was a significant battle at that point. And that's what these pictures and paintings are trying to do, is let us know how much happened here. This is an interesting story, and I have these this URL is on some small paper up here. You can come get it. It's interesting to read the archives, and you can actually read the archives where Colonel Pike floated down from basically Huntsville, floated by himself in a canoe across the Muscle Shoals through enemy territory, fired on all the time, and brought all the way to Iuka, Mississippi, the information to Sherman that says, hey, don't go on the south side of the river, go on the north. There wasn't a cell phone. You couldn't call him. And this guy lived an incredible life. He actually volunteered at Sherman's headquarters after this in the Atlanta campaign, and Sherman sent him off to burn a bridge. And as he said in his memoirs, I never heard from the guy again, but the guy lived and wrote memoirs that are incredible. It's incredible the stories that came out of this. He's a character. So a couple of things. When I researched these, I reached to a lot of people. So I want to say thanks to a couple of people. Cade Grace is the extension agent for Colbert County and a larger area. I reached to him to try to make sure at this time of year I got the fields right, the agriculture right. Ninon Parker, I thanked her. Lanny Perry, certainly Greg Gresham is another local historian who contributes a lot to my knowledge. Rick Moultrie for letting me stomp around his property. And then this is a new marker that just went up by the Sons of Confederate Veterans and Lanny's team. So there, for the first November the 9th, there's a brand new marker right off 72 that shows this battle. So it's pretty neat. This painting will go somewhere where we haven't determined yet where this painting will go on a kiosk to show, but the first one will go the Florence gunboat battle. That kiosk is being designed right now and will go right underneath the O'Neill Bridge. So the next time you go walking down there, it'll take a year to get it in place. But this, with the narrative that comes up, will be under the O'Neill Bridge. Guys, I thank you for coming out. I'm trying to get